Hi, my name's Natalie and I write as N J Simmonds. So today we're going to be talking about my latest trilogy. It's an esoteric fantasy set in London and the south of Spain, and it deals with, predominantly it's a romance story, but it also deals with the concept of fate and past lives and lots of magic. And as you can see from the covers, there's a little bit of a hint of angels. Now, I'm not saying that this is in any way Christian fantasy. It isn't. It's dark, it's gritty, the devils and the angels, and that world building is not what you get in most angelic fantasy at all. And it's not really about angels per se. It's specifically about the concept of past lives and whether we live the life that we choose to live or whether there are greater forces out there. And that's the fantasy that is soaked into our present day lives through this book. So it's not high fantasy, it's not Tolkien-esque, it's set today, but it also goes back into past lives. And we see how Zach managed to kind of infiltrate every one of Ella's past lives over 2,000 years. So the first book is The Pathkeeper. And this month, well, sorry, 28th of May, last month, the sequel, Son of Secrets, came out. There they go, look quite nice together. And the third book, Children of Shadows, is out next year in May 2021. So I'm going to be reading an excerpt from Son of Secrets, the second book, where we see Ella and Zach when they first meet in 5 BC in Tuscany. So there's a lot of historical fantasy in there as well. And then earlier on in the video, I'm also going to talk about the kind of books that I enjoy reading. This bookshelf behind me is all color-coded, and it's predominantly YA because I have written for a younger audience in the past. And there's a lot of fantasy in it as well. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what I've been up to during lockdown, which is drawing and painting and expressing myself through art. For me, the most important thing that I do is tell a story. And whether that is through my work as a writer, I not only write fantasy, but I'm also in the process of writing new series for this Manga magazine. I write fantasy books. I also lecture on storytelling in brands, universities, and I also have my own branding business. So everything that I do is telling stories, and I'm very excited that in September I'm going to be launching a brand new series. It's actually paranormal romance, a lot of fun, with a fellow fantasy writer called Jacqueline Sylvester, and the two of us will be writing as Caedis Knight. So I've been very busy. So I've got my fantasy books, my manga, and then writing as Caedis Knight, which hopefully I'll have a chance to tell you more about as the year progresses and we launch. So let's have a look at the kind of books I enjoy reading and my artwork, and then an excerpt from my second book, the sequel, Son of Secrets. So this is the bookshelf in my office. That's my desk there. It's a bit messy at the moment. And this is just one of my bookshelves, which will give you a little insight into the kind of books that I like. So at the top are my books, The Pathkeeper, which you can see has had a couple of different covers, paperback and hardback in the first edition. And then there's some Star Wars fan art, and some of the books that I really enjoy are female authors actually that write fantasy. So you've got some Leigh Bardugo here and some Victoria James, Anna Day, that's quite YA. Laini Taylor is a massive writer that I really enjoy, and V. Schwab. And if we look a bit further down, not all of this is YA and fantasy, as you can see. Big Bang Manga is a magazine that I also write manga for. Urban London YA stories. So my first edition, Out of the Darkness, is coming out in June. And then, yeah, there's some Stephanie Garber at the bottom. So my lovely colour-coded bookshelf there. Now, in my office, you will also find my art corner. And I love this corner. It's got a big inspirational wall full of quotes to keep me going and some artwork that my kids did. And then you will see my art. Now, and obviously lots of reference and notebooks. That's just a few of my notebooks with some stories I'm working on. So what kind of art do I draw? It's just for fun, really. I do have an Instagram page as well, just to share my stuff. So I like to play with pen and ink. There's some of my stuff. There you go. Nothing too thrilling or exciting. There's a bit of fantasy. There's a mermaid there. And some colourful pieces like this hummingbird. And some acrylics. So when I'm not writing and I still want to be a bit inspired, I come over here and I do some of my artwork. So let's talk a bit about The Pathkeeper, which is the first book of my trilogy, and the sequel, Son of Secrets, which look really cool when they're together. As I said, it's a trilogy, so the third book is coming out next year called Children of Shadows. So what kind of books do I write? Well, these are predominantly romance stories, but they feature a lot of dark, gritty subjects. There's past lives. It's got quite a feminist twist to it. There are angels, but this is by no means a fluffy, kind of overly romantic kind of Christian fantasy whatsoever. Please don't get put off by the feathers and think that you're getting a kind of girly angelic story, because it's not like that. It's very dark. It's very confronting in places, especially Son of Secrets. So I'll read the back of the first book so you get an idea of what the series is about, and then I'll be reading an excerpt, a little bit of a weigh-in of Son of Secrets, just to give you a taste of my writing. So, The Pathkeeper, here's the blurb. What if all our lives were mapped out before birth? Does anyone have the power to change their destiny? Ella hates London. She misses her old life in Spain and is struggling to get over her past until she meets Zach. He's always loved her, but isn't meant to be part of her story. Not this time, not ever. Little does she know that his secret is the one thing that will tear them apart and force them to live in a world that no longer makes sense. A world full of danger, lies, and magic. The Pathkeeper is a passionate tale of first loves, second chances, and invisible threads that bind us. Can love ever be stronger than fate? So that's the premise of the trilogy. And in Son of Secrets, we go back and forth. So, in the first book, you go back to World War II and you see how Ella's past life overlapped with Zach and how it was that he's managed to be in her life over 2,000 years. And in Son of Secrets, that came out on the 28th of May, so just last week, we go back to two past lives. There's 5 BC in Roman Tuscany when they first met, first time ever. And we also go back to the witch hunts of 1613 in the Netherlands. So I'm going to read you the beginning of when Zach and Ella first meet in 5 BC. This isn't high fantasy. This isn't maybe your traditional Tolkien-like fantasy. It's very much set in our world now and in the past, but with a lot of magic. So 2,000 years ago, Ella was called Arabella. Tuscany, Italy, 5 BC. Throughout my childhood, I had often heard the story of the blue-eyed boy. They called him a demon, the magical son of secrets. As a child, I was warned about the bad spirits in the woods and told not to venture further than Fiesoli's high walls, or the witches and winged monsters would get me. But, even at that young age, I knew it was impossible for there to be anything worse beyond those stone walls than what already resided within. The first time I saw him was a hot day, the kind of day that made the insides of my thighs stick and chafe, forcing me to tuck the rough fabric of my tunic between my legs so I could walk without the sting. The air was dead, nothing moved, even the flies no longer buzzed. Days like those were the longest kind. The sharp, dry grasses scratched my legs as I picked my way through the outskirts of town. I'd made that journey many times before, but this time I didn't intend to turn back. This time I wasn't seeking excitement. I was fleeing from it. There was a section of the city wall that had been damaged in a storm and was missing some stones. It was easy enough to climb as long as I pulled my skirt up above my thighs and pushed my toes through the gaps in the fallen rubble. I used the elbow of my left arm to hoist myself up, gripping tightly with my right hand. I had long forgotten that I wasn't normal, quickly grown used to the pitying stares and the way other children in my street would flinch when they saw my gnarled, twisted hand. I had been that way since birth. You were jinxed by your father's lover, my mother told me one night after too much wine. My punishment for loving that cheating rat was to give birth to a useless daughter. I reached the top of the wall and sat astride it to catch my breath. Perhaps I was imagining it, but the air felt cooler up there, like there was a possibility of hope and freedom that I was yet to experience. Reaching for the cloth sack around my waist, I pulled out a chunk of bread and tough piece of rabbit my mother had cooked 3 days before. She never asked me where I found the animals, and I never told her, although they were rarely fat enough to feed her and my younger brother for more than a day or two. I chewed slowly, wishing I'd brought some water with me, and kicked the heels of my feet against the wall. The houses on this side of town were made from straw and wood, built out of the very land that sustained them. There were a few stone buildings and walls that jutted out of the ground, but it was mainly round huts with thatched roofs. There was no one to be seen. Most women had already left for the market or were resting inside their homes after lunch, away from the heat, preparing themselves for an afternoon's work. Even the fields, normally busy with farmhands, were unusually empty. My mouth was so dry it was a struggle to swallow my bread. I clambered off the wall and headed toward a run-down shepherd's hut, hoping to find a well nearby. In the distance I could hear goats bleating, but the thick blanket of sunshine beating down upon my aching head was too blinding to allow me a good view of what lay beyond the small holding. I followed the sound of the animals, hoping they would lead me to a stream. Instead, they led me to my destiny. The scent of wild jasmine clung to my clothes as I pushed through shrubs and ducked under a wooden fence toward the dilapidated hut. Sitting on the ground with his back against its rough wall was a boy, chewing on a piece of straw that bobbed up and down between his lips. He was a little older than me, perhaps 18 or 20. I wasn't very good at telling people's ages. I didn't even know my own age, but I'd started my bleeds 3 winters ago, so I knew I was already a woman. I crouched behind a large lavender plant and stared at him, my heart hammering inside my ribcage. I recognized him straight away as the one the townsfolk spoke of, the demon boy. Even though he was at least 10 meters away, I could see his eyes shining like moonlight on still water. The eyes I'd heard didn't belong to any man. He was sitting against a low stone building, moving his head from side to side as he hummed a tune, the sunlight making those feared eyes of his glitter a sapphire blue. As he hummed, he moved his hands up and down as if he were instructing the grasses, the birds, and the trees to join in with his song. I followed the line of his bare arm to his fingertips and up to the clear skies, and that's when I saw them. Flying goats. 5 of them, with mottled brown and white markings, hovering high above the ground. Their hooves paddled in tiny motions up and down, searching for the dry grass that belonged beneath their feet. They looked down at the ground far below them in disbelief, their straight mouths moving from side to side as they chewed and pondered their predicament. I gasped. The boy turned his head in the direction of the lavender bush, and immediately the goats plummeted to the ground. Realizing his error, he lifted them up with a swipe of his hand, moments before they hit the ground, and then he set them down gently on the grass. As soon as their hooves touched the ground, they ran bleating in the opposite direction, their spindly legs shaking and slipping beneath them. I held my breath and waited for the boy to settle back down again and continue watching his herd. Instead, he stood up with a frown, brushed the red earth from his behind, and looked around him. His shoulders were broad, and his rough tunic had ripped a little beneath his arms where he'd outgrown it. His hair, lightly curled and already damp from the midday heat, stopped just above his shoulders, and his bare arms and legs were strong and brown from the sun. He took a step closer to the fence and stood towering over me, casting a shadow over the lavender bush and bathing me in ice. My face was now level with his waist. He wore a leather belt that held a small knife and a money pouch. The pouch was empty. His hands were working man's hands, large and calloused, and his nails were cut neatly. On his wrist he wore a frayed bracelet made from knotted cloth. I still hadn't taken a breath, and my head felt so light it threatened to float away from my shoulders. What would he do if he caught me? Would he throw me through the air like his flying goats? I watched as his face softened, his eyes widened, and a small smile played on his lips. Satisfied, he returned to the hut wall, placed another piece of straw in his mouth, and sat down to resume his humming. The goats were now huddled at the back of the field beneath an olive tree, glancing at him warily with their yellow sideways eyes. He reached beneath a woolen rug at his side, took out a bottle made of animal skin, and drank from it. "Want some?" he said, staring straight ahead. Who was he talking to? His animals? I'd never much liked goats with their strange mouths and demonic eyes. There was no one around but the boy and I. We were completely alone. My breaths came in shallow bursts, barely deep enough to fill my lungs. I wanted to run away, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, and I couldn't take my eyes off the blue-eyed demon. He turned his head in my direction and spoke again. "Are you thirsty?" I tried to swallow, but my throat was too dry, and my tongue, which seemed to have swollen to double its size, felt like it was made of wood. He began pouring water into his mouth from a great height, letting it dribble down the side of his jaw until it disappeared down his neck and into his hair. Was he teasing me? I still didn't dare move. "Come, stop hiding behind that plant and join me. I know you need water." Would he hurt me if I didn't obey? I stood up slowly, squinting as the sun hit me in the face. I shielded my eyes with my good hand, my sack of belongings hanging off the crook of my other arm. I kept my gaze fixed on my broken sandals and focused on the flapping sound they made upon the parched earth until I reached him. "Sit. It's shady here. You're tired." He passed me the bottle without looking at me and then reached back under his blanket and produced a green pear, which he rolled around the ground until it hit my foot. "Sit." I did as I was told and brought the animal skin to my lips, groaning with pleasure as the cool water worked its way down into my stomach. I then bit into the pear, savouring the crunching sound it made, not even stopping to wipe away the sticky juices that dribbled down my chin. I'd eaten nothing but stale bread and a handful of cold rabbit in 3 days, and the sweetness of the fruit was almost too much to bear. I mumbled my thanks but kept my eyes focused on the goats at the end of the field. I dared not look at him. I'd seen the magic he could do, and I'd heard of the dangerous things that could happen if you made eye contact with him. Legend had it that the boy had been born to a witch, a beautiful, evil woman who would entice the villagers' husbands with her beguiling ways. They said she possessed healing powers that people would pay all their gold to receive. She'd been both feared and revered, as was her illegitimate child. He was never allowed to play with other children and had remained by his mother's side or firmly clasped to her bosom day and night. The story I'd heard was that the two lived an undisturbed life alone in the woods, until one day a giant winged god arrived and whisked the witch away, leaving behind her bastard demon child. The boy had walked the town for days, crying and begging for food, searching for his mother, until an elderly shepherd who had no family of his own took pity on him and gave him shelter. And there the boy stayed, wandering the countryside with his goats years after the shepherd had died, never once venturing into town. I wasn't one for fantastical fables, but I wasn't one for taking risks either. "Why are you scared?" he asked. I could see out of the corner of my eye that he was facing me, but I directed my gaze at what was left of the pear in my hand. No, I'm fine, thank you." He placed his hand on my arm and I jumped, my breath shuddering in my chest. I screwed up my eyes and waited for the magic. My teeth squeaked as I clenched my jaw and tensed my body, preparing to take flight. "Look at me, please. I won't hurt you." His voice was barely a whisper, both soft and strong. I opened my eyes and glanced at his hand on my arm. It felt warm and heavy, not the touch one would expect from a demon. I took a deep breath and turned to him. His eyes travelled all over my face as if searching for the source of my fear and pain. As my breathing returned to normal and my jaw slackened, his gaze finally met mine, and a look of relief appeared on his face, making his eyes go from sparkling indigo to the colour of a summer sky. I returned his smile and he placed his hand back onto his own lap. That wasn't so bad, was it? The chapter goes on for quite a bit more. But anyway, that's a little glimpse of how Zach and Ella met 2,000 years ago in her first life. And from there, we also see her life in Book 1 in World War II, in Book 2 during the witch hunts of the Netherlands, and then current day between London and the south of Spain. A lot of people have asked me where I got my inspiration from my book. The truth is, I've had some experience in past life regression. I'm very interested in the esoteric side of that. But also I've lived in a lot of countries. Australia, the UK, where I'm originally from. London features in all the books I write. And I spent 7 years in the south of Spain, and I now live in the Netherlands. And in fact, the house that I last lived in Delft, was a 16th century canal house that was called the House of Fire and Water, and it features as the house where the witch lives during the witch hunts, because it was creepy as hell. So that's a bit of trivia for you. But if you're interested in anything to do with past lives, with twisting up the ideas of angels and the devil, and it's a bit of a feminist twist, if you're fans of The Time Traveler's Wife, Outlander, what other kind of Dan Brown books, that kind of fantasy. It's not high-end fantasy, it's not Lord of the Rings, it's much more playing around with concepts with a lot of romance and thrills, then the series is out in the shops at the moment. So thank you for listening, and you can find me on Facebook under N J Simmonds, and Twitter and Instagram. Thank you.